Right, so welcome everybody. It is my great pleasure today to have Clancy Wilmott here. Well, Clancy is an assistant professor of critical cartography, geovisualization and design in the Department of Geography and the Berkeley Center for New Media at the University of California at Berkeley. She's also an author. She wrote a book called Mobile Mapping, Space Cartography in the Digital. And I really liked that in the short bio that she sent over, she concluded with, yes, she actually does make maps, which I think is the whole point of the discussion we're going to have today, because I think Clancy does some amazing work, which is, I think, very much in the realm of critical cartography and critical GIS, but also actually very applied. So today she will be talking about two participatory mapping projects in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I think this is all from me. So I'll leave Clancy to her own talk, and we'll have time afterwards for chat and for questions. So if you have questions, please do put them in the chat now or later on, and I will pick them up and report that to Clancy, okay? So Clancy, over to you.
Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. It's wonderful to see you all. It's mildly early here, so forgive me if I'm a bit fuzzy. It's about 6 a.m. on the West Coast. So I'm Clancy, as Stefano mentioned. I'm based at UC Berkeley. And I wanted to basically use this opportunity to talk as a way of throwing out some questions I've been having around GIS, around the application of GIS, and ways in which we might be able to bring not just critical GIS conventions, but also critical cartographic ideas back into conversation with geographic information systems and maybe geographic information science more broadly, to deal with some contemporary issues that we've been sort of dealing with. So first of all, I should say this is a plug. This session was brought together through a collaboration between the RGS-IBG GIScience group and the Digital Geographies research groups as well. And I kind of sit between both spaces, both as a digital geographer, but someone who makes maps and deals quite a lot with geographic information systems and geographic information science. So for those of you who aren't familiar, digital geographies tend to focus on the social, political, cultural, environmental, and economic aspects of the relationship between the digital and the geographical. There are groups in both the AAG and the RGS where this is represented. This might mean in some aspects, like in my own work, cartography and GIS, but it also might mean different kinds of platform economies. It may mean smart cities. It may mean different forms of like social media, the sort of social use or the economic use of mobile phones. So it's quite a broad group of people. And I do encourage you, if you're not familiar with digital geographic research or the activities of either of the digital geographies groups, do check them out. Because there's actually, I think, a lot of potential there for really fruitful discussion. And I see in the participant list, we've already got some members of these groups already here, ready to have this chat. So basically, to restart, this presentation, basically I've put it together. It's a lot of ideas I've been thinking about for a while, and it's also in response to a question that has constantly come up in one of my other hats. I'm the AAG representative on the board of the GIS CI, which is the GIS Certification Institute, which is a certifying agency based in the US, but it's an international certifying agency about what does it mean to be a geographic information scientist and to pay particular attention to GIS, especially in a time when increasingly we're seeing spatial data science training people who deal with spatial data out of data science, not out of geography, environmental science, or any of the cognate disciplines. And part of the question is, I think, or sort of the answer is the ability to deal with geography as a particular mode of thinking, that the spatial isn't just made of data, but actually the spatial is so much more than that, and brings to bear really important critiques, questions, ideas that we might include in our GIS science and in our GIS. So the dilemma is a pretty old dilemma. So this is the one that we kind of come up against all the time. And I said in the abstract of this talk that I kind of wanted to move past this, but for those, again, let's just remind ourselves about this kind of tension in GIS. And from now on, when I say GIS, I'm meaning geographic information systems in GIS, and also the tensions between the critical and the applied. And so on one hand, we know that geographic information systems have a deeply problematic history, whether it's a GPS being steeped in a military industrial complex, the same as satellite imagery, whether it's data being extractive, and the history of data science having really kind of racist and colonial roots in colonial science, you know, from regression analysis through to object classification. We know that there are problems with the kind of energy and labor required to build systems that means that the applications of GIS are most straightforwardly put as capitalist kinds of enterprises and are bound up in system or sort of organizations, corporations like Esri that do make quite a bit of money. And similarly as well, we know that systems like GIS can be used as technologies of control. So rather than emancipating or helping populations, can actually be used as ways of monitoring, surveilling and managing them. And that is seen most obviously, for instance, the sort of state ArcGIS servers for California have a list of where they've put all the portaloos, like the portable toilets, everywhere for various homeless or houseless populations. So we know that these are issues, but on the other hand, there are absolutely valid reasons why we might use geographic information systems and how we might use them, and who wants to use them as well. So GIS is absolutely invaluable to land back movements. Most land back movements that I can think of, whether it's native title in Australia, whether it's you know, the Inuit kind of counterclaims in the 1970s in Canada, have used maps to actually stake those claims, to map out territories and to try and reconfigure the discourse about, well, what does it mean to have ownership and right to space? Similarly, we know that grassroots environmental monitoring, so environmental justice movements, GIS are really important and absolutely kind of crucial for not only just spatializing data, but for managing large amounts of data. I've seen ample examples where different forms of mapping software, whether it's Mapbox, whether it's ArcGIS, have been used to tell particularly Indigenous stories, or even, for instance, we might think about the anti-eviction project in the San Francisco Bay Area, but we also might think about Kamaruhanu, which is like a Māori project based out of New Zealand, trying to reinvigorate Māori place names. So we see these kinds of software counter mapping activities as well as crisis management. So we actually know that GIS is quite a useful tool. And there are times at which all of the questions around the first box don't really drown out the necessity of the second box. And that actually even groups who are marginalized or vulnerable may choose to use those systems despite knowing everything about that first box. And I think what I want to do for the rest of the presentation is try and think about, you know, we know this, we actually know that these are the problems, but what do we do now? Like, rather than continuously sort of thinking about this dialectic, what happens when we actually bring and examine the moments where these two sort of competing ways of thinking come into contact, and what can we draw from that? And so one way forward we can think about, and this sort of comes from the work of Donna Haraway, but also Matt Wilson's New Lines as well, staying with the trouble of mapping. So rather than trying to smooth over that tension between these two kind of truths, so to speak, what happens if we sit in between them and go, actually, can this, rather than be a troubling space or a space of conflict, actually be a space of generative critique, a space where we begin to sort of examine the limits of our knowledge and say, hey, that's okay. It's okay that our maps are limited. Maps are necessarily generalized and necessarily abstracted. What happens when we think about the process of mapping, not just the final product of the map? And also this idea that I sort of played with in a paper a few years ago, this idea of mapping with, so actually not just embracing it, but using that trouble, that space in between to go, actually, there are some ideas here that could be really useful for trying to move the disciplines of digital geography and perhaps GI science forward. So can this trouble actually help us as well put our accents to the test? We have inherited systems that are based on long histories and long trajectories, and as someone who was born on the wrong side of the map, as I often say, I'm Australian, working with systems that were not really designed for Australian landscapes were often deeply frustrating and deeply disappointing, from the fact that the Australian continent moves so fast to the colours on the maps not actually being reflective of Australian experiences. I mean, Google Maps recently even sort of thought about this and actually introduced a hell of a lot more colours to the colour palette, rather than just sort of washing all spaces to be the same kind of colour. So a couple of questions sort of to think forward into the rest of the presentation. Do different epistemologies, so ways of thinking, and ontologies, ways of being, developed out of specific cultures and environments, serve those spaces better? So rather than placing systems developed in European and North American contexts onto other places, do the ways of thinking and knowing that arise from those specific spaces in conversations with their landscapes, in conversation with their environments, actually serve those spaces better? And can we learn something from that? Equally, that can't be mapped, which doesn't fit into the map or isn't in that system, it cannot be contained or thought about in ways that we might traditionally think about GIS, or what might traditionally be in a GIS. Can they offer unique insights into the limitations and rigidity of those maps and systems? And if they can, also, then do we have to accept those conventions? Do we have to go, actually, you know what, we're gonna stick with WSG 84. Like we're gonna stick with these systems, these projections, or even these databases that we've historically used, or can we actually work towards creating other kinds of systems and new kinds of systems? And again, I am well aware there are so many of us doing this kind of work, asking these kinds of questions and developing these kinds of tentative mapping projects. So my first case, so I want to sort of spend the rest of the discussion talking through these cases. So I think I can talk theoretically as much as I want, but it's really, again, it's in the application, it's in the actually digging into that trouble where I think some of these answers may begin to appear in more demonstrative ways. So the first, so I'm working on a bunch of different projects, but these two I wanted to highlight. So this one case one is with the Sogorea Te Land Trust. So the Sogorea Te is an Indigenous women-led organisation based in the San Francisco Bay Area. And they're in the process of doing what they call rematriating land. So rather than repatriating, rematriating is to actually try and heal the land through growing, through building, through restoring native or sort of Indigenous kinds of environments, Indigenous spatial practices, etc. And they approached me via the Berkeley Center for New Media, asking basically for a bunch of maps. They're trying to get people to imagine a place that is in a way unimaginable, considering the amount of change that has been undertaken in the last 250 years in the Bay Area, to try and imagine what the Ohlone Bay might have looked like, to try and imagine what Ohlone life may look like as well. And they've asked for specifically a paper map and a digital map. And so I've been working with Sogorea Te for about a year now. So about a year, a little bit under, to try and develop these two maps that at once legible to people who might read them, but at the same time are really attuned to the kinds of spaces and worlds that Sogorea Te see. And as a kind of experiment to see whether or not we could work together, we created our first map, which is this map here. So round one, just a map, which is like, we're just going to make a map of the different Ohlone language speaking groups, the different language speaking groups in the Ohlone lands, to see whether or not we can work together. And it was actually a really interesting experience. The first thing that I discovered was actually that basic data sets can actually be really useful and important. Data that I hadn't even thought about, like the hill relief or the hill shading data. Similarly, the rivers data is actually, the ability to use that data actually was so crucial to telling the story. So what you'll notice, and I haven't seen another map of the Ohlone lands that includes both rivers and mountains. But of course, different language groups sort of made their space around natural boundaries and natural resources. So whether it's a river, you'll find that, for instance, along here, you can see that the kind of limits of each territory are based in the mountains, sort of the top of the mountain range. And here, of course, you've got the Tamian following the river here in the San Jose Valley. And so firstly, actually, sometimes easy data is actually pretty important. And the second thing was that actually there is this real issue in design and designing Indigenous spaces that tend to reinforce what we came to call in our collaborations noble savage designs. This idea that Indigenous people are something of the past, something that is done. And so you see a lot of watercolor in these kinds of maps, and you see also a lot of browns or natural colors. And instead, we really wanted to counter that and say, actually, the Ohlone is still here. Sure, they're walking around with cars and iPhones, but they're still absolutely here. This myth of erasure is a myth. That these lands are still occupied. It wasn't something that happened in the past, it's something that's happening continuously. And so we worked towards a design both based upon the colours of their logo, which they'd collaborated with to actually develop these colours. You can see very faintly there are sort of shells in the sea from shell mounds, but actually a much more stamping, present kind of design, one that actually tries to say, no, here there are people, and here are our lands. So we managed to make that map. And in that discussion, we actually realized there are a whole bunch more questions about the fundaments of GIS that we really had to tackle in the digital map and the paper map going forward. The first are the questions of projection and orientation. If you're an Indigenous group in the Bay Area, the idea of basing your maps on not just the Mercator projection, but even the kind of the Greenwich Meridian is really difficult. These are all datums that are established through processes of colonial science, of international science, of the kinds of rationalities that have attempted to erase or devalue, enslave, dispossess Indigenous people. And so how do we work in this kind of system when we're dealing with this underlying structural kind of problem? The other is data sovereignty. So rather than this idea of just data justice, rightfully, Sogorea Te were really hesitant to have data that we had found. So either their data that they were collecting or data that we had found and were reimagining for these maps on either the ArcGIS servers or the University of California servers. And the University of California, like as a land grab university, is absolutely a central part of the dispossession of the landscape. And so how do we find ways of maintaining sovereignty for Sogorea Te over their data? Similarly, this idea of the universal versus the partial. Do we have to make a map that can be made for all spaces and all times for all people? Because different people have different perspectives, firstly on the same space, but also in different spaces. And so actually, so for instance, the nativelands.ca map that they wanted the digital map to be kind of based off is a pretty classic map that seeks to sort of show Indigenous lands everywhere. But is that necessarily what we want? So we've got questions of scale, we've got questions of detail. Do we want to make this kind of totalizing map, or do we just want to focus in on the Sogorea Te experience? And what would that mean then for the different kinds of information we put on? And as well, in the archive, there is contradictory information. And that often the narratives of Ohlone people contradict the historical record as well as the very contemporary record. And finally, how do we deal with this issue of the colonial gaze, from which maps were created? So looking at a lot of the historic maps of the Bay, many of which we are using to try and establish the conditions of the Bay before colonisation, have the classic sounding depths, resource, attentive styles of maps that were very much designed for people coming to this space, to build on this space, to extract resources from this space. So how do we deal with this problem of the gaze and also these myths of erasure? This idea that there aren't any Ohlone people left, that they were totally dispossessed, that they were wiped out. And so the first map, round 2, and it's actually changed, it keeps changing every time this map changes, but we're in the process of building this map, this paper map, which in some ways is kind of liberating, going back to Illustrator, but we've had to do some really, let's say, creative computation to actually try and reproject from the center of, so here you can see LaShawn, which is Sogorea Te's main space. And so we're actually creating a map where we can reproject from their center, the center that they have chosen of the Bay. We originally had east at the top. Oh, here are also the historic sort of trails of the creeks and the historic, it will be unfamiliar to those who are familiar with the Bay Area, but this is kind of what the Bay looked like. This is what the Bay looked like before a lot of the building out, like the the way in which West Oakland was built out. Alameda was not an island, it was sort of swampy. So here's Alameda there. We've actually decided to put Alcatraz at the top. So Alcatraz is a really important space as well. Multiple perspectives as well, so a top-down kind of view, as well as a bird's eye view to try and cut through the universality of perspective as well. Lots and lots of lines. And then trying to counter the colonial gaze by a lot of maps from the sort of from the late 18th century and the mid 19th century have these views. You will have seen them if you're interested in maps at that time, of what the approach into a bay or an inlet would look like if you're on a boat sailing past. And what we're going to do is actually sort of stand at one of the shell mounds on the East Bay up here and redraw that view as if, you know, we're staring back at that colonial process. And similarly, because again, the historic record is only so useful. We're not historians either, and we're not trying to be. So trying to think about this as a space that is kind of cosmological as well as cartographical. So Sogorea Te are undertaking a bunch of walks using GPS devices between spaces. So we're going to map those embodied paths, those distance, maybe elevation, but they're still deciding paths. And if it's around the coast, there's not going to be much of an elevation shift. So we may choose to map rhythm. And around the outside as well, star maps because seasons are really important. Janella from Sogorea Te was absolutely adamant seasons have to be there. And so we've created stars around the outside that will show the star patterns of the sort of Alone seasons around the outside a year before colonization. And it's possible to compute where the stars would have been then. And also the monarch butterflies. So they've got a spot up here. So we're actually going to draw in a whole bunch of environmental things. So their spot up near Albany is one of the largest monarch butterfly spaces, sort of colonies in the bay, and they've really been cultivating that. So we're going to be actually decorating it as well with these kinds of contemporary rematriation activities as well. Now round 3, this is a bit of a headache. Oh, I've lost an image. Oh well. So basically, we're building a digital map. The ever-present Esri, which is, you know, certainly not an ideal technology, but very usable, but also has kind of ongoing cost problems, versus something handmade in Mapbox, like nativelands.ca. What is that decision there? And I frankly find the decision parameters kind of unacceptable. There are other options, but Sogorea Te, they're not software engineers, they're not coders, they're not even really cartographers. And so asking a group to maintain a site that is extremely difficult seems broadly unfair. So I kind of raised this question to myself. I'm like, another GIS should be possible. We should have better choices. And then the other struggle or tension for Sogorea Te as well we're having is between the data layer, which, you know, how do we deal with questions of vagueness of spaces that don't fully exist, or that exist only in memory or as general areas, like the village sites isn't literally a coordinate point. It's kind of a traveling, moving set of places that we kind of don't really know where they were, only that they were in these general kinds of spaces. And also the tile layer, like it's really important for Sogorea Te that if we can reproject, we should. If we can provide 3D elevation data, which kind of gives a sense of a life world, we should. That we've had to go ahead and georeference and then redraw the historic routes of the creeks. So here are the creeks here with a DEM over the top. But, you know, I had an undergraduate go through for the final project, Mia, she was really wonderful. But these are the kinds of issues that are coming up, and to the point where I'm beginning to wonder whether or not maybe we do need to actually develop something that can be used for specifically decolonial GIS work that actually allows us to do this kind of reprojection while at the same time maintaining accessibility. But that's a conversation for later. So the second case study, I don't want to take too long, so definitely want to hear your thoughts, is the Wood Street Commons. So this is a group of unhoused folks who live under the I-880 freeway down in Oakland, West Oakland. So this is I'm going to say post-industrial area that's just been left to lie fallow. There's contamination of the soil, which makes building sometimes kind of difficult. Also, it's kind of in a bit of a nowhere zone, although the developments, you can't see it in this picture, but they are encroaching. And Wood Street kind of, again, we're talking about the same kind of space, throw up a whole bunch of different questions. So not so much about projection orientation and how we can actually pay much more attention to data sovereignty, to cosmologies, but actually how can we apply different sorts of thinking about urban space into negotiations with local government about into negotiations with the local government. So Wood Street Commons, cooperative community by design, and basically they're interested in trying to build a tiny home eco-village based on the theory of the commons. And they approached me, or actually it was Cobb on Wood, which is an organisation that builds cob housing a little bit further north in the area. Asked for basically a map of who owns the land under the I-880. Oh, my map there has disappeared as well. It doesn't actually make sense unless you can see the image. So let me just find it for you. Sorry, folks. Oops, that's the Commons Wood Street. There we go. This is the map here that I wanted to show you. So basically, this brought into bear a whole range of tensions around data justice. I'm just going to move these side by side for a moment, and the limitations of the base map. So firstly, what you can see here is that it was actually fairly easy for us to get the information. We have access to a data service that provides that information to us. The people of Wood Street do not have access to that information. It is not listed on the Alameda County website and for the assessor's office. And if you want that information, you have one of two choices. You get the parcel numbers that you want and you call them. If you've only got like 5 or 6 parcels that you want to find out, and they will give you that information over the phone. As you can see here, there is not 5 or 6 parcels. And actually, we have collapsed a whole bunch of these parcels together. There are actually 3 parcels down here at the Oakland Redevelopment Agency. There are 2 parcels, Central Station Land LLC. So these are all like dozens of little parcels all collapsed together. Or alternatively, if you have more parcels, you can go down to the county assessor's office and get that information over the counter, except that it's COVID and no one was at the counter, and instead you had to go down to the assessor's office, have all of your belongings scanned by metal detectors and X-ray machinery, and then sit in the foyer on a computer under the watchful eye of 3 security guards while you individually look up each of these parcels on a computer system. So it's not particularly accessible. And as you see, you've got this stained glass window. And of course, what's really interesting and important here is there's a difference between just getting access to data, but actually making that data meaningful. For instance, AT and SF and SP and Co, this little parcel of land here was a result of a merger that didn't go ahead back in the 1980s. Oakland Redevelopment Agency still technically is the owner of this particular land where the Wood Street Commons is based, except that the Oakland Redevelopment Agency doesn't exist anymore. It was dissolved in 2012 by the then governor. And so, of course, you get these different kinds of information. Dane Changer and Fred Craves are actually the same person as well. So it's not just about getting access to data, but actually how do you make that data meaningful to people? And the other problem that we had constantly is that if you're living under the freeway, the base map, so most people are down there who are trying to figure out where things are using Google satellite as a view, but you actually can't see the majority of the space. So this is where Wood Street is basically this down here, and you can see this whole area that people are living in. And it makes a big difference whether or not you're on state of California land or any of the other land, because the Caltrans keeps doing massive sweeps and kicking people out of this land underneath the freeway. But the people who are living in the Oakland Redevelopment Agency that's owned by the city of Oakland, they are not being swept. They're actually, because they thought they were in Caltrans land, but once realizing that they, after seeing this map, that they're actually in the city of Oakland, started a series of negotiations with the city, and they're trying to actually ask for communal access or land to that, access to the land to self-govern under a theory of the commons. Okay. So from this, we kind of developed a whole bunch of new questions with Wood Street going forward. The questions of partiality and control, the kind of data shown is really useful, but then they have their whole bunch of their own data. So for instance, where the electricity points are, that they're kind of taking electricity from, where the fresh water is, that they maybe don't want to be as visible or as circulated as this kind of map. And similarly, who gets to choose that? Similarly, the ideas of the communal. Part of the problems with the base maps, and I'll go over this, is the sort of emphasis on property and this emphasis on the infrastructure over the sites themselves. The lines on the map don't really make a lot of sense when you're talking about spaces that people live. You know, it's funny because the line does make a difference in terms of how much control you have over whether or not you're subject to a sweep, but actually people don't live in such castled ways. And similarly, you know, this kind of idea of counter extraction. Well, what information can we get from different REST servers, from different open data sources that might apply to that site, and how can we recalibrate authority to also allow the folks down at Wood Street to speak for themselves? So round two, the base map. So the base map was a major issue. So they wanted a map then that they could use to make decisions about strategy, how to stop the sweeps, similarly where to build and how to actually start to develop this, and where to clean, do big cleanups as well. And so some principles we sort of developed for this base map is that we wanted to focus on lives people live in, not lines and maps. But it was important to be able to customize data, that you should be able to reveal it and hide it. And what was really important here is that not everyone has a computer. And so we actually had to try and figure out how we're going to create a GIS in a physical format. We wanted to start from this sort of starting point of a theory of the commons, not from property or buildings. And similarly, and also what it means to be down in that space as well. It was actually really frustrating making that first map before we actually went down there. And the only reason we hadn't gone down was because there was a COVID surge, and we didn't want to risk bringing COVID to such a vulnerable population. But when the surge subsided, we did go and see it. Suddenly it made a lot more sense, that space as well. And you can kind of see the verticality of the different freeways here over this soft dome tent. So these are the base maps we were looking at, and you can kind of see the problems. This is map box. We're like, okay, so they're really kind of limited here. We tried removing the freeways and just got this big blank polygon. I'm like, well, that's not particularly helpful either. So there's no point really printing out either of these maps. And even Google Earth wasn't that useful. Yes, we got to see the sort of much more detail about the verticality, and we got to see more detail about the sites themselves. You can see here there's a big difference between these two styles of map, but also we couldn't see underneath the freeways. And there's actually a whole complex set of people, so sort of living arrangements. You can kind of see it up here under the freeways, and the freeways kind of shield that from view as well, which is really useful if you're trying to avoid being surveilled, but less useful if you're trying to make decisions based upon your own maps. So we came up with an idea to actually create, a bunch of maps. I don't know what's actually happening here with this imaging. A bunch of maps based upon, so imagine as if we made our own Photoshop kind of images. And here we go. I just needed to refresh the screen. Photoshop images, sort of layers. So we could print the maps and then layer transparent layers over the top. So this is a base map. The pylons here have been painstakingly mapped by my students and I. Fences that you can't get through, as well as the path lines. And the railway tracks are really important there as well. And the footpaths as well, with the idea that you could actually, you'd have this sort of base map and then you could put layers of information over the top that were printed out on large transparencies that you could also write on. And most importantly, with these transparencies, if someone from Caltrans or the City of Oakland came down and you were busy mapping out different points, you could actually roll that information up and put it somewhere so that they didn't get to see it. Here's the maps with the verticality as well. And that was really important because this is kind of how you situate yourself, depending on where the freeways intersect and what freeway is higher than what. And just another example of another layer. So this is the parcel layer. And then, of course, you know, in theory, you can put this parcel layer and then you put the freeway layer over the top so you can kind of see how that might work. And so the round 3 was actually, I got a message from the Commons themselves basically saying City of Oakland are coming down. We want to share the vision of our map. You know, a new model for the unhoused and dispossessed, which enables us to shed our homeless status and instead be the owners of our homesteads within a tiny home eco-village with shared infrastructure, which transforms areas of open land into cooperative communities based on the vision idea of the commons. I ended up kind of we had to use a whole bunch of really weird techniques. So they wanted a map of this particular lot down here. And it was really important, again, thinking back to these shared kind of infrastructure. And I should have actually included a picture from Theo where actually I got the residents to go around and draw their maps and decide where they wanted things using this base map, take pictures of it and then send it to me and I render it and then send it back, or I'd print it out and drop it off. And then they draw on that map, take a picture of it, send it back, and we sort of had this collaborative process like that. What was really important though is that the first maps were really flat and you can't see it in any image, although you can see the sort of elevation there. There are these tiny hills all the way over there and they're absolutely crucial to understanding and reading the site. I don't want them destroyed. They're pretty much rubbish mounds that have been grown over with hills, but actually getting elevation data that fine is really hard. And the only site that had it was Google Earth. And so we ended up scribbling over and creating all these polygon, or these lines, these polylines, try and extract the elevation data and then plotting it into QGIS and then like creating triangles to then actually try and map the difference in elevation so that then we could make this map here, which you can see the hills here have been drawn using hill shading relief, so you can actually see where the hills are and the different kinds of spaces. And this is a really interesting example of a map because it's a combination of things that actually exist and things that are going to exist, and honestly things that may be just impossible. So these are palm trees near the gathering area and music stage, which they have now built, all in a patio. The flea market and bazaar hasn't been built yet. And then you've got a whole range of different homesteads, which are based on the size of a shipping container. We stole the sizing from down near the port of Oakland, and something like handmade houses, so cob houses, RVs, these soft domes, different kinds of areas. And importantly, you've got a mailbox. Wood Street is at the top. I forgot to mention that. All the maps kind of, if you put north at the top, you end up with this very long, very difficult to read kind of space. But by putting Wood Street, this is a street in which everyone walks along to get to the different spaces. So this is really one of the central thoroughfares of the maps. And they used and presented this map to the city of Oakland at a meeting down there. So these are some images of residents presenting that map to the city as a way of articulating their vision. And I remember when I said to them, what kind of style do you want this map to be in? They said to me, we want to use the authority. We want exactly the kind of style that they give us the plans for these RV parks and places that we don't want to live. We want to use that same design principle and send it back to them and go, no, this is what we want, in a language that you'll understand. So kind of, again, recalibrating this authority, using the authority to map back at the powers that be. So the conversations continue. They actually made some headway with that map, and now they're in the process of urban planning. So the city of Oakland is partnering with Habitat for Humanity. They don't really like those sort of housing plans, so they're trying to really rethink what it might mean to do urban planning and design. They want to be anti-grid. They don't like grids, which is a total nightmare for planning. But given the space, I kind of understand. And so we're trying to think about ways in which we can draw spaces away from grids that don't end up in gridded, shared kinds of spaces as well. Basing it on the theory of the commons, so rather than being just about who owns what, but actually trying to find ways of making an argument that at least 50% of the land should be common use, and that people need space away from each other, not just bound up against each other in walls. And they also have asked for a hypervisual prestige from multiple perspectives. They want to show like an architectural plan. And I said, well, to do that, we need to create kind of a model and take a picture. And they're like, no, because then we'll only have a single perspective. We actually want it to be kind of brought together. Specifically, they wanted it to look like the work of Warner Williams, who's a very well-known local artist who is known for actually playing with different kinds of perspectives. So they want this architectural visualization to be multiple perspectives. And I found that resonated really interestingly with the kinds of same demands that Sogorea Te were making about not wanting a universal gaze, but actually much more of a pastiche kind of gaze. Okay. And so to end, I just want to think or sort of raise the question. I'm really keen to hear thoughts, and I know we don't have heaps of time, but email me if you do have thoughts or ideas. So map for all, and we sort of see this idea of, maps for all, this idea of all. And I think in some ways it's really incredible to have this open idea, but at the same time, if a map for all means that the system itself, the GIS, defines the map and its possibilities, then we're actually limiting the things that we can say. It means that we can only say things that are applicable to all places, rather than, actually maybe working with the landscape itself. Open data is really important, but at the same time, and I think myself and some colleagues, Emma Fraser, Craig Dalton, Jim Thatcher, wrote a paper about the ways in which open data can be appropriated and used to, for houseless populations particularly, be used, collected by local council, was used by the UK government to eventually deport people So open data is important, but at the same time, also appreciating that some data is not for public consumption, and that's also okay. And that, you know, there's this kind of tension there. Do we need to have universalized standards? Like, do we need these sort of to keep with agreeing and coming together on certain datums? What happens when things contradict in this map for all? What happens when we've got like contestation over who owns what? And in a way, then a map that is for all, that is a truly a map for all, kind of risks the map becoming the territory becoming the map, the one-to-one scale map of the world. And so, you know, at what point is this idea of the map for every time, every space, every person, every event, kind of a very difficult ambition, if not impossible? And so instead I propose this idea of a map for some, to start with the geography before the GIS, to go, okay, well, what happens if we're just making a map for here and now? And how can we actually recalibrate or change the datums, the fixed points, the metrics even, to enable us to be more in tune with that space? And what would 1,000 partial maps that don't come together look like? Like, you know, maybe pastiche is the future. And rather than thinking about universality, so it feels like sometimes Google Maps, Esri, Mapbox are all in this giant competition to have 100% market share of our lives, with OpenStreetMap just kind of plugging away in the background, being the savior for us all. What would it mean actually if, you know, in this idea, we sort of looked for interoperability, things should be able to match to each other, rather than a universal system, but actually getting things to speak to each other, and reconfiguring the fundaments. So is another GIS possible? And I'm in the process of actually beginning to ask that question and think, well, what would it mean to actually not just adapt a GIS for Sogorea Te, but actually to build them one from scratch, or similar? And what kind of resources and cash are we going to need to do that? So that's kind of where I'm at. Okay, so I'm going to stop the share, return back to people. Thank you all for listening. It's a lot of stuff I just kind of threw at you. And sorry I went a little bit over, but of course I have the always difficulties with images in, like, sorry. I'm just pleased that I managed to actually get that done. And again, don't judge my desktop.
So Define, thank you so much. I think it's been a fantastic talk. And yeah, we have all the time in the world, really, but I guess people book the 1 hour. So if there are any questions which anybody wants to urgently ask, please do put them in the chat. I just saw one coming in. Clancy, can you see the question, or should I read it out loud?
I can see the questions. Is this from Gloria?
Yeah, Gloria, yeah.
Yeah. How to draw the boundaries of like a, so she says, I do like the map for some idea, along with the preoccupations of invasive, pervasive, all-encompassing view of the world. It can be somehow harmful or not very helpful. How to draw the boundaries though? I mean, I think drawing many boundaries, this is what we're finding with Sogorea Te, that actually we've got a lot of competing information, and historians are always kind of tend to be in a rush to try and find the most accurate representation. We're just drawing them all and laying them over each other, and saying, here are some boundaries. All of them were drawn, they're kind of lived in a way. And I mean, the point of the Sogorea Te map isn't actually to be a historical document. It's a cosmology. It's where the world is at now. So I think, and I really like that in nativelands.ca, how the actual polygons overlap as well, in acknowledgement that there were shared territories that were seasonal. There wasn't these sort of fixed boundaries. So I really like, you know, this idea of overlap, of multiple lines, dotted lines. I mean, that's a fairly classic kind of thing.
Yeah.
Or, I mean, we can just experiment. That's something that watercolor is good for, though, because as the water runs, it kind of makes its own fuzziness.
Yeah, the whole fuzzy and semi-transparent.
Yeah.
I think that's, you know, we are so used to map that literally parcel the land with no spacing between and overlap. But I think it's, you know, it's a limitation of what we're just used to. There are tons of questions coming in. There's one on what would participation and collaboration look like before GIS?
So before GIS, it's a lot of talking. It's a lot of working. So I've got, I mean, it's labor that needs to be done. I've got actually one student who's doing a really wonderful job building the color bases for the digital map. And I've asked her to come up with a bunch of color schemes. And what I wanted her to do was to draw those color schemes and textures from the rematriation work that Sogorea are doing down in their various sites, planting, growing, picking. And so she has been working down there with them on that site, literally rematriating and talking to people about their favorite plants, the colors they like, and developing that color scheme with them. And I mean, this is before we've even really thought about whether or not we want roads, whether or not, you know, the sea has to be blue. I don't know if it does. So I think, you know, participation before the GIS is actually jumping on board with them. And similarly with Wood Street, it's a lot of cleaning, actually just putting stuff in garbage bags and getting rid of it. And hanging out with people down there as well, going to their events. You know, the map is part of it, but it's very difficult to remove people's stories from the map. And I do it for presentations, but it feels, this is why I haven't published on this particular topic yet, because I mean, I don't want to talk about people, but how do you talk about a map of people's worlds and their hopes and their dreams and their futures without talking about them as well? So I mean, I think starting off with this idea of, do we even have to make a map? Is that really what we need to do here as well? You know, geography before the GIS is to start before the map and go, actually, is a map? I mean, with Sogorea Te, we started with a map and then ended up with like 5 more different versions of the map as well. So we ended up having maps proliferate. But honestly, folks out at Sogorea Te, they love maps. So I'm keen to get more of it. Wood Street, yeah, they just want you to pick stuff up and help them fight the city of Oakland.
I think the overall, I think one of the things that really was an interesting contrast between the two projects, how both projects, the relationship with sort of like the authoritative map, when one was rejecting it and the other was basically using the style and the approach of the authoritative map to actually do something. I found that it was very interesting. I'm really sorry, but I do actually have to basically close the session. If people want to stay on and continue to have a chat for a bit longer, please do. I think we until the RGS comes and kicks us out from their Zoom, the Zoom connection, I think we're fine. So please, if you want to stay. But I will sort of like close the official part of the chat. So thank you so much, Clancy, and thanks everybody for coming in. And yeah, if you want to pick up any other questions from the chat, please do.
I can moderate from here, so we'll see how it goes until they kick us off. Yeah, I think, how do you approach processes of unlearning maps with students? Well, I mean, how do you get them to ask them to make a map is actually one of the first ways of unlearning a map, because actually it's really difficult. A lot of examples, a lot of talking, with people. Actually reminding students that, counter mapping or other forms of mapping has a really long history as well. Like the maps that we see now are pretty recent, actually. And even the development of scientific cartography is pretty recent. I have a course on sort of cartography, mapping space and power that is a total experimental course. And I wasn't sure if it would work, where rather than trying to sort of see mapping as a development, we try to get away from like mapping, this idea of progress, and also try to focus, so, Matt Edney's ideas, and then of course the contrapuntal from Matt Spark. And instead we are, each lesson we focus on a thing that we're mapping, so polar mapping, different forms of fictional mapping, and actually look at all the different ways in which that thing has been mapped. So rather than sort of saying this has been the development of mapping, and the polar mapping was a really great example, kind of looking at Inuit mapping of the poles, like the carved driftwood maps, which make a lot of sense when it's dark and it's cold and it's wet. And then how perhaps the maps that the Inuits made for the explorers were carrying these paper maps when it's dark and cold and wet, actually make a lot less sense as well. So actually trying to think much more from that space itself. Similarly, mapping seas, comparing different kind of hydrographic charts to Marshallese red libs, like the island maps. So actually, I think that has helped to some degree, but I don't know.
I think it's I found that your discussion of the datum and the reprojection is also very interesting in terms of like having different perspectives. And it's one thing that for instance, it's everybody sort of like it's relatively easy to personalize your map with your favorite colors or the colors that you prefer. But at the moment, especially with QGIS, you can personalize your map very much in that sense as well. So it's fairly easy to reproject and have a different datum, which I think is also interesting connection with the history of the EPSG as a reference, as sort of like a list of reference of that of datums and projections being from a oil extraction company as well. So there are some interesting histories there as well.
Yeah, and I think, some of the maps at that scale, like reprojection, is kind of symbolic. It doesn't actually, but it's the symbolic kind of nature of it is really important.
Yeah.
And I think, I get frustrated with web mapping because the limitations of reprojection at that point start to really close in, and especially when so many Indigenous groups, there's been a bunch of papers about Indigenous mapping out. We can do it, but on a web map, like I'm just like, why haven't we made that kind of jump? Because I think at the basis, within the code and the cartographic structure itself, there is ample opportunity to actually address some of these big questions and big critiques.
Absolutely.
And I think sometimes the trouble is that as academics, we don't get time. Like that's a big project.
Yeah, it's exactly. It's nobody forces us
project.
to actually use the web Mercator. You could create a web system that uses something else. It's just the amount of work that would require is beyond probably anybody's time at the moment.
Yeah. But so we're sort of, my studio we're sort of investigating the possibility of whether or not we can get money. We're sort of in a rare position where we actually do have contacts with cartographic software engineers, because we're in the Bay, so this is where Mapbox is based, for instance. Maybe if we can get enough money from different agencies or philanthropy or somewhere, we might be able to build a system, ? Watch this space. Let's see. Heather asks, can we work with, William Mora, can we work on the idea of a 3D Makita representation as well as precise data points? Many conflicts are prevented with a well-done map. I mean, the thing about sort of the 3D maps is that they're just, it's another geometry, really. Like it's just a Z angle. And actually, in a way, 3D modeling is kind of representing the world. I always find it really weird when you're working in like Blender or Unity and you've got to like set gravity because there's no gravity. And I'm trying to explain to students that like the objects have shape, but no mass. So they don't actually collide and hit each other. You've actually got to give them all of these physics that make them do stuff. And so you kind of just creating the world again. And I think, I think 3D mapping has a lot of potential. I have a really phenomenal student, Maria Patis, who is trying to build virtual reality from the perspective of mosquitoes to investigate tropical diseases and actually try and imagine what does a mosquito world look like, because it's a very particular kind of spatiality where, something that's a line on a map could be an open window in mosquito world. So actually trying to think a little bit more like that. So I think there's a lot of potential there. At the same time, I think there was a whole bunch of, I had another student who was trying to represent sort of Sufism or Sufi networks using 3 dimensions of the relationships people had, because the question that she had was, how do we bring dreams? If someone has visited someone in a dream, but they've had a meeting, geographically, it's a ridiculous kind of, very difficult to present, but actually, can we build different kinds of visualizations to place a dream on the same value as a physical meeting as well? And she got like a cork board and pins and started drawing it, and is in the process of turning it into like a 3-dimensional kind of model that you can actually sit in and sort of start looking from the perspective of a particular person and view all of these connections around you. So I think there is potential there. But I think many of the same problems still hold with the regimentation of space and time. Like a contour just generalizes between those 2 points, but who knows what happens there? Like, it could go up and down within that space. We don't know.
There are some intrinsic limitations in representing anything in 2D or 3D, in the sense that the way we think is not necessarily, we do think that way if we want, but we also think in ways which are non-linear and non-cartographic, So I think that this is one of the key issues, and I think especially that some of the issues of representing times and how things change happens in time in a map is always being massive problem, even for sort of like more sort of like authoritative or classic maps.
Heather sort of says, sorry if I missed this, but the maps you're making with Sogorea Te Land by the community itself and to show other sides outside the community. Yes, so they're so not just for the Sogorea Te community, but also for everybody. What are the reactions when you show this map to any others outside the community, especially round 2? So round 2 is specifically designed to be, what did Janella and Karina say? It has to be a beautiful object that people will pay for. They want people to buy the map and to put it on their walls and actually for it to create this kind of, I suppose, conversation. It's supposed to be challenging. It's supposed to be a little uncomfortable. And it's funny because for people who are familiar with cartography, like, oh yeah, that's just a stereographic projection, whatevs. But for people who are used to seeing particular kinds of maps, they're like, hang on, I didn't know the world could look like that. And it's like, well, the world could look like anything if we chose to present it that way. People are usually fascinated. There's something about a map that when you look at it, it kind of draws you in to look at it more closely as well. And we're trying to, so when I've shown people the examples or I've got like I'm working on a kind of a more specific kind of sketch here of actually how it might look. So you can see here, eventually we'll do it in a big watercolor as a mixture of like computation, hand drawing, Illustrator, all kind of coming together. They want to look more closely. They want to kind of go and they're like, okay, but where is this and where am I and where are the other things and where is the familiar and where is the strange? And so I think the reaction is kind of what I want it to be. Unless I show it to my cartographic students and they're just like, oh, cool, a stereographic projection. I've seen a map like that. And then they send me like 5 different stereographic projections, like, thanks. You know, but okay. So yeah, people, I mean, it's challenging, but I think it's kind of the point. Okay, Heather.
There is one more from Jay.
Yeah. Have you ever thought about layering digital spaces over the top of physical spaces? Yeah. So we're digitizing a hell of a lot of data for Sogorea Te, with the idea that I'm pretty sure in about 18 months' time, they're going to ask us for some augmented reality and an app. I have a feeling. Yes, basically we have started thinking about that. And I think particularly powerful in areas where if you can walk along and see, well, this is where the creek used to be, or this is where the shoreline used to be. We have just placed an order for a HoloLens as well to see whether or not that might actually also help make collaborations more viable, so that they can edit the space themselves, and to start playing with this augmented reality, because I think there is something kind of really powerful about this layering. And actually it kind of, more than layering, if we follow de Souza's sort of idea of hybrid space, it sort of collapses, becomes the same space. You're kind of existing in both realms. And so, yes, I have thought about that. It's a lot of work. And you need the data. And I think one of the biggest problems we have with Sogorea Te is just no data. I mean, I'm such a chump. I end up creating a little extra credit assignment for my students because there was so much data that had to be georeferenced. I'm like, pick a map, georeference it, and I'll give you 4 credit points. Like, just help. Because again, the amount of work that is required, and no one has really bothered to do it. We've been copying and pasting the same data for like 15 years. And there's one map where someone, Matthew something, I can't remember his name, down at Stanford, did a really beautiful map of all the shell mounds and digitized that. But the creek data is actually often taken just from the Environment Agency, and the creeks don't follow the same patterns anymore. But we're lucky enough to actually have, I mean, there's a whole bunch of maps of the bay, plus also randomly we've got like a bunch of maps dumped down in my studio from like the 1850s that show the bay that no one wants. So we're actually just scanning and referencing those as well. So I mean,
which can be, yeah, it can be a quite a useful source of information as well. Cool.
Yeah, and as well, like the depth of the bay is important because during the gold rush, the height of the bay lifted quite considerably because of all the silt and sort of dirt and junk coming down through the valley. So trying to get a sense of how deep the bay was. I mean, I don't know who invented fathoms, but like, you know, every single point requires a kind of, you know, rethinking. So we're just sort of like writing them down and then being like, okay, how are we going to recalculate this into something that is readable to like us contemporary humans / non-hydrographers. You know, I don't live in ocean land that often. So their particular kinds of charts are, yeah. Cool.
All right. I think we are just about basically 20 minutes over time. So perfect. So yeah, I mean, thanks again, Clancy. It was
pleasure.
Absolutely wonderful. Thanks to everybody who stayed connected up until the end. This video will be out on our YouTube channel sometime soon. But yeah, for now, again, thanks again, Clancy. Thanks, everybody.
No worries. See you all later. It was lovely chatting.
It was really good to have you. Bye-bye. Bye, everybody.
Bye.